It's a pleasure to be here and a very good afternoon to all of you. Delighted and honored to be representing one of the most visionary technology states in India. We have a lot in common with Fintech, the state of Andhra Pradesh. We are as young or as old as Fintech itself. The state was formed about 3.5 years back as a process of bifurcation from another large state. Geographically, we are on the southeast of India, 1,000-mile coastline on the Bay of Bengal, gateway to the east and south of Asia. Economically, we are a $100 billion state, a $100 billion startup state that has a history in its previous joint state as a technology visionary state, someone that seeded the sunrise IT industry in India 20 years back. Demographically, a 50 million population. And demographically advantaged in terms of adopting new digital technologies onward to making the state a truly digital state in India. And all this is fully aligned and synthesized with the government of India's broader initiative on Digital India, Make in India, etc. So really happy to be presenting the potential and what we're doing in Fintech. I believe that in the last 18 months, as we started on the Fintech journey, digital journey, we've progressed quite a lot in terms of defining two things essentially. What role can a government organization, a state enterprise, play in adopting and nurturing a Fintech ecosystem? And second is, how does the government, through a public-private realm, the PPP model, accelerate the creation of a Fintech ecosystem, a digital ecosystem, which is a big necessity for India today as we stand at the cusp of a huge transformation. The $150 billion IT industry finds itself at an inflection point. And one of the things that we are really driving is the transformation of a services-based, large structural enterprise into a truly entrepreneurial, innovative startup ecosystem that adopts new technology, works on new technology, and is driven by value and speed rather than just by size. Now, it's titled 1 million commitment, and there's a reason, context behind it. As we progress through our journey, I will cover some of the global events that we are launching this year and next year, including a SpringFest next year and a blockchain global event this year in October. And the government is committed to announce a prize of $1 million for under various categories, for the most innovative startup, for the most practical product out there, for creation of new platforms and services. So it's an exciting time for the government to come up and put in its commitment, not just in terms of dollars and investment terms, but also in terms of adopting some of these technologies for citizen services infrastructure development, government systems, and fostering new models, operating models of public-private partnerships. Fintech Valley, the name was coined allegorical to the Silicon Valley to imbibe the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship, but it's also in Visakhapatnam, shortly called Vizag, a town that is on the east coast of India. It's actually a valley facing a sea. Beautiful place, something that that's been on the news, both in terms of adoption of the whole digital spectrum of digital technologies, cashless city, the cleanest city, as also a very important conduit into the industrial ecosystem into India. It's a port, massive industries, and a city in transition, bringing together both the old industries, steel and mining and manufacturing, with new digital technologies. The state has always been a pioneer in digital governance, adoption of digital technologies, right from the last 20 years. The first Cyberabad project was put up 25 years back, and that seeded the whole IT BPO industry in India at a very large scale, which today stands at about $150 billion. And if you look at some of the applications that we've adopted, in line with creation of the universal digital ID in India called Aadhaar, from digital financial literacy to modeling smart villages to real-time governance, dashboard-based management, to entire building of architecture of digital cities in the state. Our approach or strategy, as we may call it, comprises of 4 key elements that we are working on today, which we believe are the right ingredients to promote this new ecosystem. The first is manpower. As I said, I think talent supply chain is extremely crucial globally as well as in India to make sure that the new industry has the right set of data scientists, fintech engineers, blockchain architects, what have you, in order to kind of help build new product solutions, help build new problems. The second one is money, access to funding. How do we get the right investors? How do we build the ecosystem that attracts the right kind of investors at the right stage to promote a new entrepreneurial environment? The third is market access. I think given India's demographics, given the market opportunities in India, given the state of digital infrastructure progress, and I remember India 15 years back leapfrogging from, a telephone line available for 100 people to the third most penetrated cell phone country in the world. And today, as we stand, we're probably at 750 million cell phone connections. We'll probably overtake China in about 3 years' time, billion plus cell phone connections. Massive 4G infrastructure underway. And that gives a very unique market access combined with demographics and the digital infrastructure like unique identity being formed. So you put these three things together and gives you a heady combination of opportunities for financial services, especially using technology, platforms, mobility. The last one is mentorship. How do you make sure that the startups have the right actors, stakeholders, egging them on, trying to teach them how to solve problems, from moving over from an offshore-centric, service-centric industry which relied on client executions and an execution-oriented industry. So I guess here what the state government is doing, along with the government of India, is to really invest in education infrastructure, overhauling engineering curriculum, to create data science program, to create fintech programs, to really look at cybersecurity in its entire scope. And I guess for us, the first step is to set up an international institute of eminence that teaches digital technologies to our future engineers, and we've just set that up. And the whole pedagogy and the model architecture is based on industry participation, driven by real-life problems. And one of the things that we've done is to really look at how can we build an inventory of real-life problems from across industries and processes that can be kind of farmed out or put up for startups, big companies, investors, and other stakeholders to adopt, to solve, creating almost a virtual sandbox where all stakeholders come together and create a new model of innovation and product development. The Indian fintech industry itself is fledgling, but growing very, very fast, almost 20+% of growth. Almost 10% of that is VC funded. And I guess the exponential growth in digital banking, the agility of adoption of digital banking in India by private banks as well as public sector banks is a huge push towards creating a supply chain of digital players, of digital startup companies, especially in fintech. Key areas being payments, lending, and on the corporate side, trade finance, treasury, etc. The whole ecosystem that we today have conceptualized and have started implementing in different parts comprises of 6 key elements. The first one, of course, is corporations, big companies, banks, large non-banking financial institutions, banks themselves, education universities, engineering schools, management schools that are preparing new curriculum, that are helping train new engineers, reskill existing IT engineers, etc. And then the accelerators, incubators that work with us on our innovation hubs. We got a global network of mentors from leading companies. These are Fortune 100 companies. Interested in setting up centers of excellence, in different stages of setting up centers of excellence with universities, with government, etc. And then the investors and startups. So if you look at this whole model, it's an amalgamation of the right set of actors coming together with different roles, and the government sitting right in the middle and promoting, facilitating, and making sure that the ease of doing business is absolutely transparent and quick. Some of the partners that are already on board with us, big names out there. Visa is partnering with us on a cashless city implementation. MasterCard, HDFC is a big private bank in India. Broadridge, Anthill, doing a lot of work on blockchain. The government is implementing blockchain in several areas, which is traditionally seen by the public and the citizens as a non-transparent. For instance, land registry. How can you digitize real estate assets? How can you infuse greater degree of efficiency and transparency in the process of management of physical assets and digital assets? The funding in India is, I think, remarkably taken off in the last 2 years, totaling up to almost 1.8 billion, and it's growing. It's growing because I think we're seeing newer models of fintech coming up, both from big players as well as from small players. And the operating models of banks themselves are changing. Digital-only banks, digital-only finance companies that requires further downstream infrastructure support and different types of processes that can be orchestrated and brought together into a seamless supply chain. And I think the setting up of the digital identity, Aadhaar, has a huge role to play, with India Stack providing an ecosystem of APIs that startups and established players can use. And I think that's the next real blueprint. The 2.0 version of the universal digital ID and how banks or startups or other fintech companies can access data is a topic of big discussion, huge actions happening around it, with the right kind of regulatory support, the right kind of data governance support, and a whole lot of participation from different countries that have business interests in India and see this as a positively huge opportunity and source of disruption. Our journey so far has been to kind of look at different elements of how do you create and become an attractor of the right ecosystem. And I guess the roadmap is to really take this to the next level. In the near term, in the next 12 months, we are aiming to have 50 plus startups, fintech startups, digital startup, blockchain startups actually working out of the fintech valley, throw them real life problems through the use case repository build-up, and make sure that we facilitate the right kind of interaction model amongst different stakeholders. Fintech Valley in 2018 would see few global events happening, attracting the best of brands, attracting the best of brains with the right incentives. And I think we'll also see a huge market access opening up via the use case repository and the inventory of knowledge and problems that we are building. The Global Blockchain Summit in October is looking at bringing together the best of DLT, crypto technologies and applications. And I think if we're looking at it in two ways. One, are there global opportunities that startups can contribute to? Second, what are the market opportunities within India to implement DLT-based applications? The FinTech Spring Summit in early 2018 is a broader one, and I think the objective there is to bring a broader set of players into promoting the whole fintech ecosystem, accelerate some of the growth curve of some of the established players, as also introduce some new methodologies, some new models of doing business in the space. There will be an innovation showcase, and I think what we're trying to do is to set up centers of excellence in different areas that will actually feed into fintech product development. We got an accelerator, like everybody's got an accelerator, but I think what we've done is to kind of really shrink the surface area of how an accelerator helps a startup. And I think this links back again to some of the points that I mentioned about creating industry use cases with industry participation. ICICI Bank is the largest private sector bank in India. Mahindra Finance is a non-banking finance company, part of a large business conglomerate. And I think these are some of the examples of how we're bringing some large interested market players into the whole ecosystem to spur the development of new product ideas and new fintechs. There's a lot we're doing in terms of what we can do to a startup, whether it's an Indian startup or an established fintech company wanting to get market access, set up business, promote business in India. And it includes a whole lot of infrastructure support, a whole lot of governance support, plus tremendous amount of mentorship, a 16-week resident program, free working space, world class. So I think these were some of the things that we learned in the last 20 years in the growth of the IT industry as to what entrepreneurs need while they're focused on solving customer problems, expanding their market access, and how can government bring together the right set of participants to make sure that everything else, the enabling factors are right in place. The use case repository, as I talked about, is very unique. I think we're probably the first ones to think of something at the scale. We want to make sure that some of the discussions around blockchain, around crypto, around newer applications of fintech are not just theoretical, conceptual, but have an actual pragmatic application and problem solving in the real world. there is a dedicated international level university being set up for digital education and infrastructure development. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and to contextualize the 1 million commitment. I guess the government, politically, economically, and socially, is extremely committed to make fintech a very integral part of our GDP growth in the state, not just to attract investment, but to ensure that there is a market development in India for different types of participants to come and leverage the emerging opportunities. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I would like to have, happy to take any questions offline post the presentation of Arifa. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am Arifa Khan. I am from the state of Andhra Pradesh, and I have had the privilege of being a blockchain advisor to the Chief Minister, who is one of the most visionary leaders in the world as far as technology adoption is concerned, and as far as progressing and growing an economy is concerned. And I've had the privilege of advising him before blockchain became a buzzword. A little story on how I ended up there. Summer of 2015, I was in Tokyo, and I was knocking the doors of several big banks like Sumitomo Group. And I was there discussing $1 billion deals with them. It shocked them on multiple levels that there was a woman in their office, and the woman was discussing finance deals. And the woman was trying to negotiate, what is the best rate you can give me? Can you give me less than 0.5% of an interest rate? And I had the leverage of representing the government of India, so I got away with it. So despite the significant cultural differences between Arifa Khan and the Japanese bankers, on the last day of my trip, I managed to clinch a deal, which was for $500 million and 1.6% interest rate. And this was for a long-term bond in Japanese yen, and they even offered me a very innovative collar wherein they would absorb the risk of foreign currency exchange between yen and dollar for a certain band. So I was very excited because to heighten the drama, there was also Goldman Sachs in Tokyo representing another ministry of the government of India. And they were trying to arrange meetings for the Ministry of Finance to secure the best terms of financing. So when I went back to India, very excitedly, I offered this to the minister, and I said, okay, I have a deal. And we were all very excited. Then came the realities of executing the deal. So I realized there were regulatory considerations that I was not made aware of. And then we started looking at the regulations, and the bureaucrats came in and said, hey, this can't be done. Okay, then I went to the RBI, which is the Reserve Bank of India, and I tried to study the regulations and said, why can't this be done? This is the best rate. So several loops and iterations later, it was impossible to get even the two parties come together face to face. So that's the realities of capital markets. So I left it there, and then a couple years later, which is today, I studied the inefficiencies in the global capital markets, and I also happened to meet Vitalik in 2016. So I took him to India in 2016. Of course, he didn't need much convincing, but I told him whatever technology does, the moment you introduce it to India, it automatically gets an inflection point. So he bought me on that idea. And when we went in 2016, we felt that the blockchain adoption was very rudimentary, and beyond Bitcoin exchanges, there was nothing. But when we went again this year, we saw that the growth trajectory for blockchain adoption had significantly altered in India, and we were actually seeing global standard of applications being developed. So one of the winners of the hackathon, in fact, came up with a micropayments channel, which impressed Vitalik, and we gave away the prize. So several discussions later, I came up with elaborations on what are the inefficiencies in capital markets because of my background in investment banking. So to give you one example, there are several inefficiencies. This is just one of them. And this is a gross simplification of the realities that happen in capital markets. So I'm just comparing emerging markets on the top and the developed economies at the bottom. So emerging countries like China and India have excessive savings rates because we are conservative in nature, and our households save excessively compared to the developed markets. So these excessive savings naturally should find an outlet and go towards enterprises in these countries. But that's not what happens in reality, because our enterprises actually need a lot of capital, and they're growing much faster than companies in the developed economies. But our household savings are not going to them. So the household savings are actually flowing to the developed world, because the asset management industry is very sophisticated, and our savers are able to find much higher returns in the institutional investment world in the developed countries. And at the same time, the capital is again flowing back from the developed countries to the developing countries, whereas fixed capital or fixed investments are concerned. Because we don't have much capital. When I say we, I'm talking about developed countries. And we are taxed very high, so we have not only a corporate tax, but we also have a dividend tax. So we cannot offer high returns to our domestic investors. And capital is scarce, so we have to pay very high returns to the foreign investors. And therefore, it's inefficient because the capital is going through multiple loops. So this is just one example. There are several in the example. There are several in the real world, apart from this, like foreign exchange regulations, like agency problems that banks have. For instance, Indian household savings are entrusted to banks to on-lend to companies. But these banks, instead of lending to high-growth companies, they end up lending to the Prime Minister's friends, for example, or big companies which are probably distributed among 10 loans instead of 10 million loans. And most often, these 10 loans are defaulted and willfully defaulted, and we have no recourse to them whatsoever. And who absorbs these costs? Of course, the savers. And therefore, our savings rates of returns are low, and our rates of borrowing the capital for enterprises are very high. So both of these can be improved upon, and therefore, I came up with this solution, which is the decentralized global capital markets platform. And the idea for this came from Vitalik's definition of a smart contract, which says a smart contract is a mechanism involving digital assets and two or more parties, where one or more parties puts assets in, and then these assets are redistributed or reallocated to other parties after a certain period of time, and depending on some data points which are not known at the time of setting the contract. So what does that mean for real-world financial markets? It means that any transaction, any process which signify most of the things that investment banks do. For example, in securities issuance, you have processes like book building, you have syndicated loans, you have bond issuance, and so on. All these are processes. If you just, for a moment, ignore the existence of investors or your lack of access to investors, you can replicate all of these as a smart contract suite. So there is nothing that the bankers are doing magically that you cannot do with a smart contract, if it is a simple process of book building. So if you replace everything manual that the bankers are doing with a smart contract suite, then of course there is still a value add that people can do, which they can advise, saying, okay, your book building process says the optimal stock price is X, and what should I do now? I mean, such an advice, you can still depend on somebody if you still think the bankers are relevant. But you don't need to pay the 7 to 10% that all the banks uniformly charge, surprisingly. And recently, OECD has come up with a statement as recent as June, saying that there is a tacit collusion among banks, which all offer the 7 to 10% pricing, which is actually taking away from the productivity of the companies, because these are subtracted from the issue proceeds, and that is limiting the number of companies that go to the capital markets. So we propose to build one platform, which is a two-sided marketplace, which brings together investors on one side and issuers on the other side, whether it is governments, whether it is corporates, or non-profit institutions. Then you replace the manually intensive processes with the smart contract suites, and then intermediaries are relegated to some functions, but not the core function, and they don't operate in an opaque box where you have to pay them whatever they dictate. What are the benefits of this platform? So first of all, disintermediation of investment banks, where you take away their fees. And two, there is no frictions of interaction between the capital seekers and capital investors. That itself is a big deal, because now, let's say there's an innovator in Kenya who comes up with an idea like Uber. He doesn't have to wait for market realities to become favorable to him. He can expose himself on a global platform, and if somebody is interested in his idea, he can immediately get an investment, just for an example. For example, Indian infrastructure opportunity is $1 trillion opportunity. Andhra Pradesh, for example, is seeking a lot of investors because we have to build industries, we have to build infrastructure, we have to build cities, we have to build education institutions, and so on. And the Japanese people are really keen to invest in us. So we want investors from everywhere because we want smart investors who will also help us with technology. So if we can reach out to them directly, instead of us having to physically go to each and every country and marketing ourselves to them, which our chief minister does quite eloquently and elegantly, still it would bring down the cost tremendously, it would improve our reach, and it would just raise much more finance than if we were doing it just manually. And this is also potentially a foundational infrastructure for an app marketplace where all the intermediaries and several other layers of players that the capital market participants usually take roles in. And this is also decentralization of innovation, because at the core level, what we are doing is decentralization of access to capital, which is a big deal. So I've often heard Vitalik talk about the applications of blockchain being in the long tail. So basically, he believes, or a lot of exponents of blockchain have believed, that the biggest blockchain use case was Bitcoin, and now that it has been milked as much as you can, the other applications of smart contracts and so on are in the long tail, meaning that each of the application only has an incremental impact, but not a tremendous cataclysmic impact. I disagree with that, because when blockchain comes to real world, for humongous institutions like investment banks and like financial infrastructure, and I mean real financial infrastructure, not the crypto infrastructure and not the crypto securities, then it's going to be having an impact of multiple billions of dollars. And that's not a long tail impact of blockchain, that's a real significant use case of blockchain. And we have the privilege of being allowed by the Andhra Pradesh government to build the first pilots for bond issuance on blockchain. We'll be developing several other applications as well. So I'm indeed extremely grateful to the Chief Minister and the team here who has taken up the advice of making blockchain its focus and also providing us opportunities. Thank you.